Right, so a subscriber sent to me a CPU monkey benchmark and specs list of the supposed M1X, and I want to say something up front. I am definitely very skeptical about this. They claim it's a pre-sample version of the chip, and I don't tend to believe that because CPU Monkey isn't very reliable, and also the chances of a site getting hands-on with a pre-sample version of Apple's future Apple Silicon chip is very small, and so I do want to say, take this information with a gallon of salt. Does that make sense? I don't know, a gallon? A lot of salt is needed for this report because, yeah, even I'm not sure about the credibility of this information. But the supposed specs they do show us does make some sense, and so I thought, basing off that, we can talk about some possibilities as to what we could expect with the M1X in terms of specs and potential performance. And so without further ado, make sure to like and subscribe, click that notification for the latest Apple news and rumors, and with that being said, let's just tuck in. Right, so the first thing that's mentioned is the CPU cores in the supposed M1X, and it makes a lot of sense. So essentially they claim there's going to be 8 Firestorm chips and 4 Ice Storm chips, and yes, those are pretty cool names, but essentially what they're trying to say is I'm going to be seeing 8 power cores and 4 efficiency cores. Now this actually ties in with a report from Mark Gurman a few weeks ago. So he mentioned that internally Apple is working on chips for MacBook Pro and iMac models with up to 16 power cores. But he does specifically mention that when these end up going into production, the amount of power cores might be slightly less because, of course, making 16 power cores for every Mac possible on a mass scale is a very hard thing to do. And so that means that realistically, we can only see 8 or 12 power cores in these final products. So yes, I know that everybody would love to see as many as 16 power cores, but realistically, 8 power cores makes a lot of sense, and let me remind you that is double the cores in the M1 chip, and let's assume things are linear. That could mean we get double the CPU performance of the M1, which is pretty incredible. Now in terms of the base clock speed of the M1X, this site assumes it will be 3.2 GHz, so exactly the same as the M1 chip. Again, I think that does make mostly a lot of sense because this is based on the M1 architecture, and so for it to repurpose the same cores, it does seem pretty plausible. Right, we come to internal graphics. So this is going to be the big step up for the M1X because we know the CPU prowess of the M1, but when it comes to the GPU, it's not so impressive, and so hopefully the M1X impresses us in this regard. And basically, CPU Monkey claims a few interesting things. So number one, they claim we'll see 16 GPU cores. I think that makes a lot of sense since we have an 8-core GPU in, of course, the M1 machines, and so double that for the M1X, yeah, it seems very plausible. Now, it doesn't mention whether this GPU is integrated into the SoC or it's some sort of dedicated GPU coming to the more expensive MacBook Pros, but I'm assuming it's the former because I think Apple values efficiency above all, and so yeah, that could be what's possible, though there could be some variants of the MacBook Pro with discrete GPUs available to, of course, get for an additional price. We also have the same base clock speed as the M1, but more importantly, I think for a lot of people, it says they can use a maximum of 3 displays with the M1X. Now, I believe Apple claims the M1 MacBook Air and the M1 MacBook Pro can run one external display with up to 6K resolution at 60 Hz. So of course, for a lot of people who rely on external displays, the fact we can get a maximum of 3 with the M1X is obviously going to be a huge improvement. But now comes the dodgy part, because of course I told you guys to take this information with a humongous gallon of salt, and here's the reason why. So it says the max GPU memory of the M1X will be 16 gigabytes, and that makes no sense because of course you might know with the M1 transition, Apple brought unified memory, which basically means the memory is shared amongst the CPU, the GPU, the I/O controllers, and pretty much other components of the chip without having to pipe the data through PCIe. And so when this supposed laptop has a max memory of 32 gigs, then we should see 32 gigs of that memory being available to the GPU too, because everything is unified, everything is shared within one same pool of memory. And I have one more issue, because the max memory of this supposed machine that we're testing on was 32 gigabytes, and again, that makes no sense because the Intel machines we have right now, the 16-inch MacBook Pro, that has up to 64 gigabytes of RAM. Now yes, I'm aware that Apple Silicon is extremely efficient, and so many could get away with 32 gigabytes of RAM instead of having 64 gigs like they usually would with an Intel machine. But ultimately, I don't see that being the case, because with the entry-level machines, pretty much all the RAM options were identical to the Intel models. And of course, having more RAM is something a lot of pros benefit from. I mean, I'm kinda sorta professional, I guess, and I do need as much RAM as I can get for a better editing experience. And so I would appreciate having the max of 64 gigs, and I'm assuming a lot more people would as well. So yeah, that part too seems a little dodgy. Anyways, going back to, I think, some credible information, we have a TDP figure of apparently 35 watts. So essentially, the TDP is the thermal design power. It's how much power consumption the chip needs under the maximum theoretical load. And for reference, I believe the M1 is around 15 watts. And so, yeah, this is a massive jump. And so this is going to be an absolutely beastly chip. But it does actually get me worried about one thing I mentioned in a previous video, and that is battery life. So as powerful as the M1 is, because its TDP figure is pretty low, it means it doesn't draw as much power, and so that's why we have incredible battery life on the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro. And so undoubtedly having a higher TDP means we have to sacrifice on battery life, and so that's a worry I've had, because the 16-inch is a behemoth of a device. It's completely fine. It has a humongous battery to take advantage of this chip, but the 14-inch MacBook Pro will probably be very similar in size to today's 13-inch form factor, and so having the same battery capacity with a higher TDP means that battery life is going to take a substantial hit. And that might not be something a lot of consumers want. Now, there are several ways of counteracting this. For example, Apple could give us two modes possibly, a battery efficiency mode and a performance mode. Or what I think is more possible is that, much like the A14, maybe the software can shut down certain cores when they're not in use. So maybe you're doing some light browsing on the interwebs, and so the chip obviously doesn't need maximum performance, and so it can shut down the cores that aren't active to save battery life. And then when you need the raw power of the M1X doing pro things, you can have that, and the machine will give you every bit of performance, but you have to sacrifice on battery life. Now, of course, another possibility is maybe Apple makes the physical device slightly thicker and gives us a bigger battery, but of course, I don't think that's the case. I don't think that will happen, because I feel like Apple doesn't want to make the MacBook too thick that it becomes a little unwieldy. And also, Apple never really gives us humongous batteries. For example, on the iPhone 12, they made it smaller to save money, and so I don't think they're going to be making batteries any bigger. I think they'll let the software and specific hardware to, of course, improve efficiency. I think the final tidbits in this supposed spec list is the release date and the machines we could see this in. So release date is going to be Q2 of 2021. This would of course align with Mark Gurman and Quo's prediction that we can see the MacBook Pros around mid-June. But personally, I have been thinking that maybe we could see these machines as soon as March. In fact, there was evidence of a 16-inch MacBook Pro supposedly being ready for the initial M1 event, and so because it was already in production but was slightly delayed, there is a high chance we could see it in March, alongside, of course, the 14-inch MacBook Pro. And of course, in a previous video, I delved into some code from macOS beta suggesting 4 new Macs were on their way, and so yeah, I think there is a possibility we could see the iMac and the MacBook Pro at the March event, and feel free to check out the original video in the iCard above. Oh, actually, I do have one more thing to mention regarding the devices, because apparently, according to CPU Monkey, the iMac will use the M1X. Now, I'm pretty confused by that. Maybe the lower end version of the iMac could stick with the M1X and the higher end versions could get the M2. That seems pretty plausible, but for the most part, I think the MacBook Pros and the iMacs won't be really sharing many chips, and so yeah, I think that is also a huge red flag as to why this might not be legit. But tell me in the comments below, what are your predictions for the supposed M1X? What do you think Apple's going to be offering with these next-gen Apple Silicon chips? Tell me all about it in the comments below. And on that note, thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe. Click that notification for the latest Apple news and rumors. Check out a video here in the icon above about the Apple Watch Series 7. And on that note, I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya, peeps.